All right, so just has to make sure that the volume is working. Sounds like you all, yes. So,
Might be a lot.
got that going. All right. So last time we started talking about the foundations of philosophical ethics, and we talked about Republic and Plato and Socrates' ideas of knowledge, conduct, and governance. Those are the three questions that philosophy tries to answer. Just as Socrates had a very famous student whose name was Plato, Plato has an incredibly famous student whose name is Aristotle. And Aristotle never fully breaks with his teacher, but he does come up with some different ideas about ethics and the question of knowledge and conduct and governance. That is more scientifically based. So when I used to teach political science, I would say that Plato was the first, or Socrates and Plato were the first political philosophers. Aristotle was the first political scientist. He looked at the world from a much different perspective. He was trained as a physician, and so he had this biological bent. And so where Socrates and Plato looked to the realm of the forms, and there's a very famous work of art that depicts, Plato looking up and pointing to the heavens, and Aristotle looking to the ground. He was much more interested in the quantification of things. So Aristotle looks at the world in a slightly different light than his teachers, in that he looks at what it is we can know from sort of the scientific perspective. And in doing that, he looks at, for example, governance. So Socrates and Plato come up with this idea in Republic of the idealized form of governance that at the end of Republic, Socrates is forced to admit will probably never be implemented. But that's not the point. The point is not the business of the philosopher is not to tell you what's actually out there and what's going on in the world. The business of the philosopher is to tell you what is the best that we can become, not necessarily what is what we are, right? But Aristotle looks at this from a different perspective. He, for example, studies 350 Greek polis, and he classifies those into governments of one, a few, and many. And he sort of does an analysis of what makes a good government, what makes a bad government. And so he comes up with this scheme. What you see throughout Aristotle's writings, in my opinion, is this idea of a balance and proportionality. So all of the other theories that we'll study and all of the challenges to ethics that we'll talk about focus on discrete acts. They focus on what it is you're doing right now and whether or not that is ethical or unethical, or whether or not we can even classify something as ethical or unethical. Aristotle tries to focus on the whole human being. And so virtue ethics is this holistic approach to ethics. It's the only one that is holistic, and that what it attempts to do is transform you as a person into something that is the best that you can become. How do you do that? Well, it's again this balance and proportionality. So what we have to do, according to Aristotle, is you have to determine, first of all, what the purpose of a human being is. What is the purpose of human life? As marketers, what is the purpose of our business? It's to satisfy wants and needs, right? What is the purpose of the human life then? Well, according to Aristotle, the purpose of a human being is the eudaimonic life. Now, a lot is going to depend on how we translate this word from ancient Greek. Eudaimonia. What is the eudaimonic life? Most people translate this word as happiness. And I don't think you can translate it as happiness, because it's not happiness as in drink up, let's have another round, right? Like that's transitory happiness. And it ends, with a hangover, right? You've got to come up with something else. Well, Daniel Robinson, who taught at Oxford, and Sir Anthony Kenny, I think, come up with a better definition of this word. And it's not happiness, it's the flourishing life. What is the flourishing life? Well, it's one, you get two very different answers depending on whether or not you read the Nicomachean Ethics or the Eudamian Ethics. Most people take the Nicomachean Ethics as Aristotle's most complete work. Sir Anthony Kenny says that the Eudamian Ethics is actually the later work and perhaps the more complete one. But in one of these books, what you get as the flourishing life it's the contemplative life. And in the other, you get the answer that it's the life of the good lawgiver. Now, these are two diametrically opposed life. The contemplative life is not one in which you are an active participant in politics in the world. But if you look at Aristotle's life, that was his life. He was enormously contemplative, but he was also the guy who was advising Alexander the Great. He was engaged in studying the cuttlefish and studying the polis. He was thinking about these things very deeply. So the end of a human life is the flourishing life. Well, what is the flourishing life? You have to reach the terminus ad quem in order to answer that question. So let's suppose that you see me out on the sidewalk. I just actually took a phone call or made a phone call to my dentist's office and confirmed that I have a dental appointment on Thursday. I'm one of these enormously bizarre people who likes going to the dentist. I have been blessed with fairly good teeth. I haven't had a lot of problems. I've still got all of them. In fact, it was rather remarkable. The dentist always has a new hygienist. Every time I go, he's got some new hygienist. And the last one 6 months ago was like, oh. And I'm like, what's wrong? And she's like, oh, you have all your teeth. Apparently that's an exception for somebody from Guthrie to, still have all of their teeth. And actually I don't. When I got braces, they took out 4 molars to make room. And I actually still have my wisdom teeth. Because they did that, they took out these 4 teeth and made room, and I still have my wisdom teeth. So I've got most of my teeth. I wouldn't have been able to keep all of them, or the wisdom teeth, if they hadn't extracted those 4. But she was like, kind of amazed that I had this mouthful of teeth. It's apparently an exception. And that's an indication of good health, right? So I say to you, you see me on the sidewalk and I say, well, I'm going to the doctor's office. Well, why are you doing that, Grant? Well, because I want to make sure I'm healthy. Well, why do you want to make sure you're healthy? Well, because I want to live. That's the terminus ad quem, right? The point at which it no longer makes sense to say, well, why that? Most people want to live. Very few people commit suicide. Very few people take their own lives. Even in the most wretched conditions, people cling to life. That's the terminus ad quem, the flourishing life. Why is it that we want to live? Well, because we want to thrive and we want to survive. So if we come up with the purpose of a human being, which is to have this flourishing life, well, how do we achieve that? Well, again, for Aristotle, it's about this idea of the golden mean. So if we look at Aristotle's politics, and we can get a lot, and I did this in my last class because we're talking about virtue ethics in there, we classify governments, and you see this in Aristotle, into good governments and bad governments. You have good governments of one, a few, and many. A good government of one is called a monarchy. A bad government of one is called a tyranny. A good government of a few is called an aristocracy. A bad government of a few is called an oligarchy. A good government of many is called a polity. And the worst form of government of all is a democracy. That's mob rule. Now, of these types, Aristotle says, this one is probably the best. Because if you have a good government of one, it's likely to devolve into a tyranny. It's very easy. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's very easy for a monarch to devolve into a tyrant. If you want a historic example of this, take Henry VIII. Henry VIII starts out as an enlightened despot. He's very schooled in the humanist tradition, and he wants to be that. But he goes a little, crazy when he can't produce a male heir, and he keeps blaming his wives for this, and he cuts off some of their heads on trumped up charges. He becomes a tyrant. Turns out that the problem was with Henry, right? Nobody knew this at the time, but the male determines the sex of the offspring, not the woman. Right? But that's not the way ancient people thought of things. It was, it's got to be the woman's fault. So he keeps having these female children, and one of which becomes one of the greatest queens in the United Kingdom's history, Elizabeth I. So it's this balance and proportionality. Aristotle talks about this in terms of friendship. What as salespeople can we learn, for example, for those of you that are sales majors, from Aristotle? We can learn a lot. Aristotle says there are three types of friendships. There's friendship that's grounded on pleasure. These are your drinking buddies. And when you go to whiskey school or AA or whatever you want, they're going to tell you have to change your playgrounds and your playmates because they'll lead you into, temptation. So you got to give those up. So there's friendship that's grounded in pleasure. There's friendship that's grounded in utility. These are people that are useful to you. Now, most of you have had a job in here, almost all of you. You're business students. You're not like the lazy liberal arts kids over there who, sit around in the lotus position, contemplating their karma. I mean, you're all, alert and chirpy and want to get a good job. That's why you're here. Musical theater. What are you going to do with that? I just I don't know. These waiters, over at Bricktown Brewery over there, what's your degree? Musical theater. You're going to starve to death. You're you're the poster child for natural deselection. So you have this job, you make friends at the job because you need these people, to help you be successful in your job. But when you leave the job, and you're going to leave your job, most of you are not going to be like me. I have been here for almost 30 years, right? I mean, I started teaching here when I was 22 years old. I've been here a long time. And I've had pretty much one career my whole life. It's been doing this in one form or another, either as a political scientist or as a marketer. And most of you are not going to have that luxury. You're going to go from job to job. You'll change. Most of you will change entire careers in your lifetime 2 or 3 times, let alone employers, right? So you'll start out doing one thing and you'll change. That's just the nature of the workforce today. That was not the nature of the workforce, for example, when my grandmother and my grandfather were in the workforce. I always use them as an example. My granddad worked on the Manhattan Project, which was the bomb, building the atomic bomb. And he worked for Sandia National Labs. When he died unexpectedly of a heart attack at age 34, they went to his widow, my grandmother. My grandmother had started out as a teacher. And in Kentucky at the time when she started out teaching, she was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. And the minute you got married, if you were a woman, you could no longer be a teacher. You were fired because you were no longer chaste. You had experience of the world and you couldn't be a school teacher. So she couldn't be a school teacher. So when she married my grandfather, she became housewife. When he died, the president of the Sandia National Labs came to her and said, "Tunny, we have a job for you." My grandmother had a master's degree, which was very unusual. And they made her the classified records librarian for the lab. So she classified all of the nuclear documents. And she stayed at that job until she retired, and she had a pension from that job. And she married my granddad's best friend, and when he died, she got his pension. So she had 2 pensions and Social Security. She made lots more money retired than she did working. That's unusual. Most of you will go from job to job, and you will form friendships at these jobs. And when you leave those jobs, you'll find other friends, right? Because they'll be, useful to you. In the middle is perfected friendship. These are the friends of a lifetime. These are the friends who not only will be there for you when you're down and out, they're the ones that will help you move the bodies, right? It's not that these people aren't useful to you, and it's not that they don't bring you pleasure, they do, but that's not the basis of the friendship. You befriend these people and they befriend you because you want what's best for them. It's this balance. Yes, they're useful. Yes, they're pleasurable, but you want what's best for them. Throughout Aristotle's writings, we see this idea of balance and proportionality. It's this form of government that's the least likely to degenerate into a bad form of government, because there's enough people that you have some checks and balances, but there's not so many that you can be swayed by a demagogue. Or if you have absolute power, degenerate into an absolute tyranny. So what we see is that you look at what are the extremes of character, defects of character. For example, what is an extreme defect of character? Cowardice. The coward is someone who is always willing to run. At the opposite end of that is heedlessness. This is the person who, at the slightest provocation, is willing to fight. I had a friend like this. He was a lot of fun to party with. But I mean, if anybody looked at him wrong, I mean, it was just, and he was a little guy. It's always the little guys. I mean, he would take on people that were like 3 times his size, but he was fast and he was wiry, and he could fight. And it didn't matter. I mean, like the slightest thing, if anybody said anything, to him, that was it. The courageous person is somebody who knows when to fight the good fight, when it's worth fighting. When I was a child, I used to debate constantly. My parents and my mother would become completely exhausted with me, and she would say things like, "Grant, you cannot ride a dead horse," to which I would respond, "You can sit on it a while." I mean, I was always willing to engage in an argument. The courageous person knows when to argue and when to fight. So it's this balance of proportionality. One of the criticisms of this is, how do we determine what the virtues are? Aristotle, I think, does a pretty good response of that. He comes up with, this is the term of sed quem. Lots of people say, well, how do you know that the eudaimonic life is the right one? Well, I think it's a pretty good model. Most of us want to live. Most of us want to flourish. Then the next criticism is, even if you can determine this purpose of a human life, how do you determine what the virtues are? I think Aristotle comes up with a pretty good formula for that. And then finally, the criticism, and this is the hardest one to deal with regard to virtue ethics, how do you teach people these virtues? Can we do it? Is it possible to teach them? Well, it's not entirely clear to me that it is possible. But again, you don't need the philosopher to tell you what is out there. And we have at least one example, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin is our favorite founding father. He's the only one we know by his nickname. Ben Franklin. You don't hear anybody say Tom Jefferson, right? It's Thomas Jefferson. But we know Franklin by his nickname, Ben Franklin. He noticed at an early age that he had certain leadership qualities, but he was likely to lead boys into scraps. And, for example, he noticed some stones that had been delivered to build a house at a location. He decided that, boy, wouldn't that just make a great little thing? They could make a pier out into the middle of the river and use that to fish. And he stole the stones and made this little pier. And his father, he got caught, and his father chastised him. And he learned from that. And he came up with 13 virtues. Why 13? Well, if you multiply 13 times 4, what do you get? Somebody tell me. 52, right? Yeah, it's up there. 52. You get 52. How many weeks are there in a year?
52.
52. So you can get through 4 complete cycles in a year. It's the reason why historically the major stations, ABC, NBC, and CBS, had 13 episodes in a series. So you had a fall lineup, a spring lineup, and then you could have 2 sets of reruns, right? So you had 13. Came up with 13 virtues, and he put them down on a piece of ivory. And if he had what he called were spots, he knew there was more work to do. And he tried to live these each day. And I think they're pretty useful. Temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence, speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Avoid gossip. Order, let all things have their place. Let each part of your business have its time. Resolution, resolve to perform what you ought. Perform without fail that which you resolve. Frugality, make no expense but do good to others or yourself. Waste nothing. Industry, don't lose any time. Always be employed in something useful. Again, Franklin was very aware of his own image in the public mind. He noticed at an early age, again, that people thought of him as sort of lazy and a layabout. And he set about never to be thought of that way again. He was constantly involved in something useful. People have called Franklin a man of many masks. And if that's true, they fit his face fairly well. He wore them all very well. He was a scientist, an inventor. He invented all kinds of things. And he never took out a patent on these inventions. We still use these things today. The Franklin stove. It's a wonderful invention. Very, very efficient for heating a house, right? Fireplace, the vast majority of the heat goes up the chimney. But if you have a wood-burning stove, a Franklin stove, you get the benefit of all the heat. Bifocals, he invented those so that he could see both far away and close up. Sincerity, use no hurtful deceit, think innocently and justly, speak accordingly. Justice, wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty. Moderation, avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they will deserve. Cleanliness, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Tranquility, be not disturbed by trifles or accidents, common or unavoidable. Chastity, rarely use venery. This is an old-fashioned word for sex. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness. Weakness or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. And humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. So we have at least one example of somebody who became his own sociological and psychological experiment. And he tried to live these things. And I think he did a pretty good job of that. So let's talk about some more modern theories.
So out of those 13, which one do you think is the most important? Like if you had to pick
Moderation.
one. Huh?
Moderation, I think, is probably the most important. I think that one embodies everything. The don't do anything to excess. Don't drink or eat to excess. As Americans, we tend to not practice that one at all. We have a tendency to do everything in the extremes, right? Modern ethical theory. Utilitarian ethics. This one has its origins, wrong side. This one has its origins in the Enlightenment. And it gets a bad rap. It's associated largely with a thinker called Niccolò Bernardo de Machiavelli. And Machiavelli, in his most famous work, The Prince, never comes up with the formulation, the ends justify the means. But Mill does. So in the Enlightenment, so we can market the origins of this with the beginning of modern thought. And if I asked you, when does modern thought begin? What would most of you say? Who has an idea of when modernity begins? Nobody has an idea?
I'll guess the Industrial Revolution.
That's what most people say. That's the number one answer that I get from most students is the Industrial Revolution. Modernity actually begins before then. And why? And actually there is a historian, there's one historian who thinks that it is the Industrial Revolution. He's absolutely wrong in that. His argument is that the Industrial Revolution brings modernity to everybody because all of a sudden we have mass-produced goods. From a marketing perspective, for the first time in human history, we have the ability to consume more than what we need. And so it's the demarcation of the point at which we see the epitome of an idea take fruition in history. And so he argues that most historians place modernity as beginning with the Quattrocento. And that's the 15th century, the 1400s. It begins with the discovery of the New World, the Americas, and a thinker named Niccolò Bernardo de Machiavelli. So Machiavelli is a Florentine official. And what marks this period as being modern is that this is the beginning of the modern banking system, for example, with the Medici in Florence, and Machiavelli's writing The Prince. Now, Machiavelli considered The Prince to be a minor work, and he is forever sort of disparaged as a result of The Prince. It becomes his most widely read work. If you want to read a work of philosophy, that Aristotle is very difficult to read, right? I mean, it's very thick, it's heavy. Republic reads like a play. It's got characters, there's Socrates, and there's these other interlocutors. It's easy to read. The Prince is enormously easy to read. You can read it in one sitting. It's a very pithy work, and it was not what Machiavelli considered to be his magnus opus, opus magnus. It is written for a very specific purpose, but in it, you see the first inklings of what we consider modernity because it denies the existence of the importance of the divine or God in everyday life and government and the state. So Machiavelli never says that the ends justify the means, but you can tease that out of The Prince. So in The Prince, politics and ethics for the prince are different than for you and I. For example, if the prince has to lie in order to maintain sovereign power and the position of the state, well, then that's just what has to happen. God has nothing to do with it. It's just about pure application of political science to the real world. So it denies the divine right of kings. It's just about raw power. Machiavelli writes this work because he's out of power. The Medici were slightly out of power for a very brief period in Florentine history. And during that period, Machiavelli rises. He becomes an ambassador and a high official of state. And then when they come back into power, he loses his job and he writes this book for Lorenzo Medici in an attempt to regain his position of power. And it is just an exercise in pure power. Machiavelli's probably greatest work, in my opinion, if you want to know who Machiavelli really was, it's not The Prince. you would have to read the discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy. And in that, he talks a lot about other forms of government, and particularly Republican forms of government, which influenced our founding fathers, I think. But utilitarian ethics says, look, what is right is what brings about the greatest happiness for the most number of people, so the ends can justify the means. Actions are all based, their ethical analysis, on what the results are. Most business students like this theory the best because it is the one that you are trained in from the beginning of business school. You are trained in, for example, the fundamentals of economics and a capitalist system, which is what? Well, it's the maximization of utility. That's what economists will talk about, the maximization of utility. What is the maximization of utility? From your own perspective, you have this money that you get from these jobs that you have, and you want to make that money go as far as you can. You want to get the most bang for the buck, right? That's what you want to do. In ethical terms, what utilitarians say is, it's not getting the most bang for our buck, but it is producing the greatest amount of happiness for the most people. So utilitarianism is the basis for capitalism, and it's all based on results. Now, there are two forms, and one of the things that they attempt to do in the second form is cure the problems with the first form. So the purest form of utilitarianism that you see in Mill and Jeremy Bentham is called act utilitarianism. So in every situation, we have to analyze our actions and try and produce the greatest number of happiness for the greatest number of people, not for ourselves. We are an important consideration, but it's for everybody involved. Now, it's really easy to do this if you have very limited numbers of facts and possibilities. It's very easy to calculate that happiness if you have very discrete situations in which the number of actors is very limited. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, if I have a plate full of cookies, if I bring a plate full of cookies in here, how should I distribute the cookies? Well, I want to make sure that everybody gets a cookie, and that's going to bring the greatest happiness for everybody, right? That's a fairly straightforward situation. There's a limited number of people in this classroom. I have these cookies. I'm going to make sure that everybody has a cookie, right? You are taught this, going back to virtue ethics, in grade school. We try to instill these virtues in you, starting with the idea of, you learn in kindergarten that sharing is caring, right? You got to share your stuff. I never had this experience because my birthday is in July, so I never got to bring cake or cupcakes for my classmates because, I was always off at the time my birthday was, which was a great advantage because I never had to go to school on my birthday. And, God knows I hated school. That's why I became a college professor, so I could inflict the pain on everybody else. So, I never got to do this, but people who did have their birthdays in October and November and stuff would bring cupcakes, and you couldn't just bring the cupcakes for the kids that you liked. You had to bring cupcakes for everybody, right? And that's a very nice, discrete situation. What about if life gets more complicated than that? Should we judge, for example, Henry Ford is the father of the modern automobile. There were automobiles before Henry Ford came along, but he made it economical for everybody to own one. And we all have these now, right? Everybody came here. I'm guessing you didn't ride your horse or, hitch up the buggy and to the horse and ride over here. I'm guessing you came in a car.
Mhm.
Well, how do we how do we determine whether or not that was a good thing overall? I mean, automobiles have produced enormous amounts of suffering. Sure, we all get here. I live in Guthrie. That would be one hell of a ride. You know, I like horses. I think that's one of the reasons why I got this job, because the department chair also shows horses. So we had that in common. And I think that's one of the reasons she favored me. And, you know, I mean, there weren't a whole lot of people that were clamoring for this job because UCO doesn't pay what a marketing professor should be paid. So, I mean, we're paid well, but we're not, you know, I'm not paid what most of my colleagues now make, over $200,000 a year. By this point, no, I'm not anywhere near that. It's over six figures, but not 200,000. So, you know, why do I stay? Well, I don't know. I have this business in Guthrie, and, you know, I've got a family, and there are other reasons that keep me here, even though that I get a job offer every single year to leave, and it's for far more money. But, you know, I have a paid for house here, so you do the trade-offs, right? And I do the calculus on these things. What would be the most amount of happiness? Well, you know, probably my staying here, because I've got a mother who's, you know, in her mid 70s, and she's had cancer twice. So, you know, I'm a good son, and I stay. And that brings, you know, probably the most amount of happiness. Again, that's easy to determine, but let's go back to the car. I came here today in a car. I drive, you know, although I will tell you that I am probably the only socialist business professor you will meet. The vast majority of your professors here are, you know, I think I've done a poll, they're almost all Republicans, you know, God help their little souls. I'm probably the only socialist, you know, voted for Bernie Sanders twice, love the burn. That you're gonna meet. But in spite of the fact that I'm this, you know, liberal, kind of, you know, long-haired hippie socialist, I drive a very Republican vehicle. I have a Dodge Ram 3500, which gets a whopping, you know, 17 miles to the gallon, whether you need it or not, right? And it burns diesel, which is like a big pollutant. They've tried to make them cleaner. You have to add this stuff to them now called DEF, which I just think is some communist plot, you know, you shouldn't have to do. But, you know, like you can see my truck, it's parked out there. It's got these extra wide hips on it.
Why do you drive a truck?
Because I have horses and a boat, and I have all kinds of toys. Like
Oh, okay.
I
Okay, my bad, okay.
have a big horse trailer, and, you know, I was born and raised on a cattle ranch.
Okay.
What else do you drive?
A truck,
Pull it with
a pickup.
Huh?
You can pull it with the Fiat.
You can pull the trailer. No, you can't pull it with a Fiat.
You just can't put anything on the trailer.
Right? Yeah. No. I had a boat that weighed 22,000 pounds that I hauled all over the planet.
That's why you have diesel.
Yeah. So this vehicle has brought an enormous amount, and all vehicles, of happiness. We all want to get places faster, but on the downside, what's it caused? Well, there's lots of fatalities as a result of crashes. There's an enormous, I mean, for the first time in human history, we have more people that have asthma and horrible upper respiratory conditions as a result of the fact that we're all driving these vehicles. And it's really bad in places like Oklahoma City, and we don't even necessarily control. So we have frontal passage on average every 3 days in Oklahoma. In the winter, that frontal passage is from north to south as we get cold fronts. In the summertime, it reverses, and as warm air builds in the Gulf of Mexico, it pushes northward and we get warm fronts. And we have this huge community 250 miles to the south of us called Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. and it takes all of that pollution and just dumps it right on top of Oklahoma City. And we bust our ozone requirements or regulations all the time as a result of that. The amount of lung cancer from those pollutants has increased. That's a horrible way to die. How do you measure? Would you say Henry Ford was a bad man for developing this thing that he couldn't have possibly foreseen? They didn't have any idea about air pollution when he developed the automobile, did they? They had no, I mean, they didn't really understand what it was from a scientific perspective the way we do today in terms of particulate matter per million and what's a safe level. And Oklahoma City is not even in the top 10 worst places, and yet we still have this, like, go to LA. During the pandemic, when the economy basically shut down and people were staying at home, you can see visible improvements in the air quality in places like Los Angeles and Singapore and Hong Kong. I mean, would we say Henry Ford was a bad man because of this?
No.
I don't think most of us would say you could hold him responsible. I don't even know how you calculate the greatest happiness in a situation like that, right? So in order to try and deal with this problem, a second form of utilitarianism develops, which is called rule utilitarianism. This is predicated on the idea that, look, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with rules that in the aggregate produce the greatest amount of happiness, right? Because we can't know what, ultimately is going to be, we're going to produce rules. So we have the EPA, for example, that produces clean air guidelines. We have this idea that we need to reduce emissions. And we're now giving you, or we did, I think that they expired, but there are tax credits for things like buying an electric vehicle or hybrid vehicle in an attempt to cut down on the pollution that we are experiencing. The pollution that we have produced is resulting in the melting of glaciers, right? Now, it's involved in this huge climatic change. Now, personally, if the sea levels rise and we all of a sudden have oceanfront property here in Oklahoma, I think that's a great thing, I'm like worried about global cooling. I don't like to be cold. But, scientists tell us that this is not necessarily a good thing. So what we'll do is we'll come up with rules that in the aggregate produce the greatest amount of happiness. This is illustrated by something called the hypothetical of the serial murderer. Let's suppose that a police officer knows the identity of a serial killer like Ted Bundy, right? Very bright. Most serial killers are enormously intelligent. They evade prosecution for long periods of time. And usually they only get caught, people like Ted Bundy, because they really want to be caught. They want the notoriety. That's what they're interested in, right? So, but he was enormously bright. He had gone to law school. I don't think he completed law school, but he actually did conduct a big portion of his own defense, and he was pretty polished at it. Now, let's suppose the police officer knows the identity, but because we have this system of justice in the United States that requires guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, what's a reasonable doubt? Again, I'm going to tell you that I'm in a minority here, but I'm probably one of the few people who watched, you all are too young to remember this, but watched the O.J. Simpson trial and thinks that O.J. is innocent. And I'm going to tell you why I think O.J. is innocent. I spent 4 weeks, 1 year in Los Angeles with a friend of mine who was having a major surgery on his leg and couldn't leave. And so one of the things we did is we went from OJ's house to where he allegedly killed his ex-wife and her boyfriend at the time. And I don't think you can conceivably get from his house to that point in the amount of time that they said that he did and get back and get into a limousine and get on an airplane. I mean, it's just not possible. There are literally like no left turn signals in LA. Like, I mean, like you just have to like gun it and hope for the best. They just don't have left turn signals at that. So I don't think you could do it, but you know, like these are the reasons why OJ was acquitted. Like if the glove does not fit, you must acquit, right? I mean, they got real ballsy with this, and they had this glove that he was allegedly wearing when he committed the murders, and there's these, you know, DNA and all of this on this, and Johnny Cochran has OJ try the glove on, and it doesn't fit, right? You have a racist cop who was known to plant evidence. I mean, like all of these things, like either of those alone is enough to create reasonable doubt, and OJ walks. Now let's suppose you have somebody like Ted Bundy and you've got this reasonable doubt. Should a police officer, knowing that they've got the identity pretty well ascertained, go ahead and take Ted Bundy out? An act utilitarian would say, yes, that's justifiable. Like if I smoke him, it's completely okay. Because we've saved resources, we're not going through trials, we're not going through appeals, we're not wasting, you know, we're not having another life out there on the line. A rule utilitarian would say, you know, although that is going to produce the greatest amount of happiness in this instance, in the aggregate, if we believed that the police did this on a daily basis, we might be skeptical of the police. There's a movie about this that came out with Sylvester Stallone called Judge Dredd, where the police are judge, jury, and executioner, and the citizenry is naturally afraid of the police, right? Because, like, you know, the police are just going to kill you if they, you know, catch you committing a crime. By and large, on the whole, although our system of justice isn't perfect, we tend to believe that this principle that the police are not judge, jury, and executioner, that we go through trials, and that at trial, you have the right to confront witnesses, you have the right to an attorney, you have the right to remain silent and not take the stand against yourself and incriminate yourself. We think that by and large, on the whole, this produces the best results. It's not efficient, right? Dictatorships are efficient. And where they disappear people, that's an efficient form of government. It's not the best form of governance. So we'll come up with these rules that say things like, you know, the police don't kill people. They have to arrest them, and that you have the right to a speedy trial, and that trial is public, even though most of us would probably prefer not being put, you know, in the spotlight. What does a public trial ensure? It ensures that we don't disappear people in this country the way they do in other countries, where if you're an enemy of the state, you just disappear. The problem with rule utilitarianism is that, can we come up with a rule for every situation? Probably not. And there are some things that are beyond the law, right? There are some things that we just think, you know, like that's just beyond the scope of the law. I'll give you an example. Let's suppose you are applying for a job, and I can do lots of things to hurt you in this class. I could fail you, prevent you from graduating, right? Let's suppose you apply for a job and you ask me to be a reference, and I say, sure, I'll be a reference for you. And your prospective employer calls me and says, I have Mr. or Ms. So-and-so here. They've applied for a job as a sales professional at Love's or at Paycom, or, you know, any of the other companies that we partner with. What do you think of them? And my response is, well, I wouldn't hire them. They were in my class, and they're enormously slow-headed. And if they got any dumber, we'd have to take them out and water them 3 times a week, turn them towards the sun. Every single time they opened their mouth in my class, they subtracted from the sum total of human knowledge. they're morally bankrupt. You know, I think that like they, you know, they're not even worth the bullet that it, you know, take to shoot them. And you don't get the job. Have I harmed you?
Yes.
Yes. Can you sue me?
Yes.
I
No.
hope so.
Well, you can sue. You can,
There's workers' laws.
you can sue for anything, but have I said anything that's anything other than a matter of opinion? You know, I have these little prairie dogs, and compared to prairie dogs, I am a genius. Compared to Einstein, not so bright, right? I'm just not that bright. Compared to a prairie dog, now prairie dogs are very smart little creatures. They have the largest vocabulary of any animal that they've tested. They speak with adjectives and adverbs when they communicate. Very, very intelligent little creatures. Not as intelligent as I am. But again, I'm not as intelligent as Einstein. You don't get the job. I've done nothing but express my opinion. Have I harmed you? Sure. Does the law provide you with recourse? No. You can sue me. You're going to lose, and I'm going to get my attorney's fees out of that. Now, let's suppose that I take it one step further and I say, and Mr. or Ms. So-and-so is a known felon. Do you have a cause of action now?
Yes,
Yes, you do. Why?
defamation.
Well, that's not, I mean, like this,
Just kidding.
the defamation is the general category. You have a cause of action because that is an objective fact to which we can ascertain the truth. Not bright, stupid, slow-headed, all of those things are matters of opinion that we cannot verify. But are you a convicted felon? We can verify that. We can go to the record and look. And if you're not a convicted felon, then you have a cause of action. But you can see that there's a whole lot of space in between my saying convicted felon and everything else that I've said that's harmed you. And we just can't come up with a rule because we have this conflicting rule, which is that we want people to have freedom of speech. We prize this idea of freedom of speech to the point that I can say a lot of things that hurt you. Other countries, by the way, don't allow you to do these kinds of things, right? To say things like that. So we can't come up with a rule for everything. So that's the other problem with rule utilitarianism, is that we just can't cover a rule that has everything. In opposition to utilitarianism, we have duty ethics. What duty ethics posits is that we cannot base our moral judgments on the results, because results are oftentimes very difficult. Even in very discrete situations, I've given you several that are fairly straightforward, but let's just take an example. How many of you did this? I did this when I was a kid. My brother and I thought, you know, we're gonna like be really good and we're gonna cook our parents' breakfast. And we tried to do that. I think I was like, 8 or 9 at the time, and my brother was, 3 or 4, and it ended horribly. Like with grease fire, smoke alarms, and a gigantic mess. We had a good intent, right? And that's what duty ethics would say is, what really matters is your intent, not the results that follow from it. There are 2 forms of duty ethics. Religious absolutism, which is probably the oldest. Again, you can answer these questions of philosophy, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, the question of governance. You can answer these questions with using religion or using mythology, or you can use philosophy. If you use religion or mythology, you end up with these interesting results. The problem with using religion or mythology is, whose religion are we going to use? And even if we use the same religion, even if we all agreed that, the United States is largely a Christian country, whose book are we going to use? There's differences in the Bible, right? There's a difference between the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible, right? There's differences in interpretations of that book, right? The King James Version is different than the Catholic Bible. And then how are we going to determine what interpretation we should use, right? There are many passages in the Bible, and we can all come up with different interpretations of those. Let's just take, for example, Leviticus 18:22. If a man lies with a man as with a woman, they have committed an abomination, their blood shall surely be upon them. We're going to stone the homosexuals. When the word abomination is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is never meant to be used as something that's innately immoral. This is part of the holiness code. It's also an abomination in Leviticus to eat a shrimp, to wear linen and wool together, to plant two crops in the same field. When the word abomination is used, it's meant to denote something that is against custom. It's not customary. The prohibition, there are a handful of references, for example, to homosexuality in the Bible. And what those prohibitions really represent, according to the rabbis, in the interpretations of the Talmud, are allowing a nation to grow. The Israelites were a very small people in a hostile land. And it was about allowing a nation to grow. It's the sin of Onan. Onan spills his seed upon the earth, and God strikes him dead. For the ancient Hebrews, they believed that male seed contained all of nascent life. And if you're not protecting that, there is no ability for the nation to grow. We've now reached a point in human development where we live on a planet that can comfortably sustain about 3 billion people, and we have 7, right? You have to think when you read the Bible. And this is the problem with using it as the basis of our religion or basis of our ethics. Kant recognized this, so he comes up with an alternative, which is rational absolutism. Rather than relying on the book and someone's interpretation of the book, we can discern what the right courses of action are a priori. So what is it for Kant? What is the categorical imperative? So Kant has 3 great works. The first is a critique of practical reason, the second is a critique of pure reason, and the third is the metaphysics of morals. Now, in the critique of practical reason, Kant says there is a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is one that exists because you want something. Why is it that you're sitting here listening to me at 10:30 in the morning, go on and on and on about Kant and religion and all these other things, rather than going out and, I don't know, having Starbucks with your friends? I hate Starbucks, by the way. I tell my students when we go on trips to sales competitions, there are 2 things that will result in me punching you in the throat. You mention them to me. One is Starbucks, which is the tool of the devil, like serious tool of the devil. The other is Chick-fil-A. Those 2.
Why
You mention
Starbucks?
Starbucks is horrible.
Okay, but
They
yes,
have
but why?
crappy coffee.
Have you had the blonde espresso?
Coffee should be drank black. Like, you know, there's.
What's
you
your
don't-
reasoning for that?
That's the way coffee, I like that, that's the way God and the baby Jesus intended it.
Which is evolution,
You know,
and there's
No.
innovation.
that's like mixing stuff in the, no, that's a cardinal sin. And they have horrible coffee. If you want good coffee, go to Dunkin' Donuts.
Whoa,
Dunkin'
what?
has like great coffee. McDonald's has better coffee. In every blind taste test, McDonald's coffee beats Starbucks coffee every single time. Starbucks is horrible coffee. And Chick-fil-A is shitty chicken. I mean, it's just crappy chicken, like, don't mention those two, like,
Have you
No.
had the spicy chicken sandwich with cheese on
no.
it? You don't even
No.
taste it. It's perfect.
Like,
Let these
no.
in.
It doesn't even taste like
It's
chicken.
it's on horrible bread with, oh my God.
So what's better than
You gotta
Chick-fil-A?
add
I go,
Chick-fil-A
what's your
sauce on
preferred?
top.
Well, like, I would prefer like to not eat fast food,
But
but,
if
you
you
know,
had to though.
I think Popeyes has better chicken. I think like KFC has better chicken.
You got food good.
Although KFC is always out of chicken.
This makes me sick.
I'm not sure why, but
I didn't mean to derail us. I was just shocked by the whole Starbucks factor that just really threw me off.
you're like, no, Starbucks is horrible.
We can get back on topic, I'm sorry.
Do not bring up Starbucks.
If you're looking
Last
at it,
semester, what, go ahead.
if you're looking at it in a utilitarian
Uh-huh.
point of view,
Oh.
who is worse, Starbucks or Chick-fil-A? Who brings the least amount of happiness to you?
Ooh.
Oh.
Uh, Probably Starbucks is the bigger tool of the devil, like, you know. But Chick-fil-A, I mean, I don't know, like, that's. I don't know that anybody like dies of, you know, like clogged arteries from crappy coffee, but, you know, so maybe it's Chick-fil-A, I don't know. That's a hard moral judgment.
Utilitarian ethics, it brings the greatest amount of happiness to a lot more people. Like Chick-fil-A-
Starbucks does?
Starbucks and Chick-fil-A, I mean, a lot of people are happy because of those places.
I don't know, some people are still depressed.
I agree with that.
I think that's a false sense of happiness. Like,
But how do
I
you
don't like
define
either.
what a false reality happiness is?
Chick-fil-A?
But how do you define what a false version of happiness is versus a reality version of happiness?
Literally, you're financially worse off. I mean, like these people who go to Starbucks 3 times a day, like financially, like you're like, oh my God.
But if you have a gift card, it's not
It's awful. It's just absolutely horrible. Anyway,
Yeah.
so how do you determine what is universal maximum law? Well, it has to be logically consistent. It has to be based on reason, allows for no exceptionalism. And Kant says, for example, what is going to meet the categorical imperatives? So a hypothetical imperative exists because you want something. You want a better job, which is why you're sitting here listening to me go on and on and on about the evils of Starbucks and Chick-fil-A, even though I can tell that a lot of you are not converts, but maybe you will be by the end of the class. You know, that, yes, I like you. This is a dictatorship. This is not a democracy. Anyway, why is it that you're here? Because you want something. You want that piece of paper that says you're educated and that'll get you a better job, right? We know that if you want to make more money, you should get a degree. Probably not one in musical theater or some other, you know, useless pursuit, but a degree in business that'll allow you to get a better job. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, has moral import. And Kant says the way we determine these is, for example, these universal maxims always treat another rational being as a means to an end, or as an end in and of themselves, and never as a means to an end. So never treat another human being as a means to an end, as a tool to satisfy your wants and needs. Well, what does this mean? Well, you can't start to recite the categorical imperative and have a couple of glasses of wine and not begin to laugh. What does it mean? Never lie. Now, I will tell you that as a neo-Kantian, it's the reason I'm divorced, right? It's the reason that I'm not married, because I have a tendency to think you should never lie. So, you know, how do I look in this outfit? You look like hell in pastels, Robin. Go back upstairs and change. I will not be seen with you in that outfit. And thus I am single. Right? Brutal honesty.
Oh my god.
Like that's what it is. But why is it that you should not lie? Well, according to Kant, it's because when you lie, you're manipulating other people to get them to do what you want them to do. Right? Like, and you're saying, well, how are you manipulating somebody by saying, you know, you look fine in that outfit. And every woman, by the way, knows that fine, like men do this, they think that this is a safe spot. Like, how do I look? Fine. Fine stands for freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. You look fine. No, like just be brutally honest. Go change. Like you look horrible in that. You're manipulating them because you want to avoid the fight. You want to avoid the divorce petition that's inevitably going to follow when you're like me and you say these things. You know, when you say the quiet part out loud, it can lead to conflicts. But Kant would say that's irrelevant. You need to be honest because you can't manipulate people to do what you want to do. You have to allow autonomous individuals the right to make up their own minds based on the best available evidence. And if bad things happen from that, then that's just too bad,
But
right?
how is your delivery considered manipulation?
If you say like you look fantastic in that and they don't, you have manipulated them into believing something so that you can avoid a confrontation that's not true.
Well, you're choosing to lie then. But if you say, well, how about you try these other options, you're just broadening the scope. You're not really saying
Yeah,
it's good or bad.
here's the deal with that is that like there is nothing in the middle of the road except dead armadillos. Take a position, right? Like the dead skunks, armadillos, that's all that's in the middle of the road. You need to take a position. You know, like be firm.
But why does everything need to have a position?
You like, again, you know, back to the 13 virtues, silence, speak not what to, you know, but to benefit yourself or others, never engage in trifling conversation.
Yes, I agree
Right.
with that.
Yeah,
That's not what you're doing.
yes it is.
No. You
Yes,
said
like
that
I
you
am,
speak it.
I am cutting to the point, right? Like I am eliminating the inanity of, you know, trifling conversation. You look like hell in that you know, I'm like, it's, what?
Oh my God. But like the delivery is not manipulation. And I don't think that you need to pick a side to everything.
Lying about it could be manipulation though, because
It
you
is.
could be wanting,
Absolutely.
you could be wanting them to like look bad so that nobody else looks at them in public. And
Right. Or just because you just don't want to have a fight. You know, okay.
But you can say you look bad in it, but say you look like hell in it is two different things.
Yeah, that's what I said. Step warmed over.
Okay. I just know you're very black and white and I'm very colorful. That's what I think.
Lots of people would agree with you, right? You know, that's one of the problems. Like this is the hypothetical of the inquiring murderer. You live next door to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mr. Smith gets drunk and beats his wife on a regular basis. He's told her that if she ever leaves, he will kill her. You see Mrs. Smith pulling out of the driveway one day. She says, I'm going to the home for battered women. Please don't tell Mr. Smith where I've gone. Where's my wife? Kant would say, you have to tell him that, you know, if bad things happen, that's just too bad.
Is that what you would do?
Most of us say things like, and this is why I say I'm a neo-Kantian. Most of us say things like, in that instance, yeah, you need to lie, right? But it should be an exception. I think one of the problems that you have with duty ethics is that in Kant's absolutism, if you pinned him down and said, why is it that ultimately you shouldn't allow lying? It would be because we could never form any kind of society if people lied to each other all the time. And if we thought that people were lying to us, we would naturally be skeptical. And isn't that really a backdoor way of saying that results do matter? That they do count? Yeah. Adam.
I know this is a big hypothetical scenario, but let's take this and interpret it however we need to. If you don't want to lie, you have this information, you know where she's going, but you don't want to lie to him, don't open the door.
Yeah.
Don't open the door.
Don't
How
open the
does
door.
he feel about just not saying anything?
Don't-
Not lying, but not telling.
I think Kant would say that's an act of omission, and that ethically it's the same thing. You know?
You tell him he's just like a piece of crap and he can go.
Again, one of the things that makes this interesting is if we have very discrete situations where you have one choice or another, it's easy to determine these things. When you talk about the complexity of human experience, and this is why I think virtue ethics is really what we should think about, because for Aristotle, lying is not necessarily a priori wrong, but it's certainly not something that we should engage in on a daily basis, right? I mean, it's about understanding moderation and understanding modesty and understanding temperance, right? I mean, I have a tendency to just be sort of, as you said, black and white. But I think that it's about trying to develop the whole person. And I think that's worth thinking about. These others are nice. These other theories are nice because they tell us what to do in discrete situations. But oftentimes in those discrete situations, there are ramifications that are felt way beyond what we think about in terms of the immediate. Yeah, yes.
Is being black and white, like, not a practice of modernization?
I think that for Aristotle, probably being absolutely black and white. I mean, lots of things are shades of gray, right? I mean, that's the reality. We think that there are some absolutes, right? I think, for example, in the law, capital murder, first degree murder, or murder in the first degree. You know, the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. I think all of us would say, absolutely, you shouldn't do that, right? Like you should not engage in the indiscriminate killing. Now, there are lots of reasons that you can kill somebody.
But what if you're on an island deserted and you need to eat?
What?
Should you kill another individual to you know? I mean, that gets a little creepy, doesn't it? You know?
It's happened.
Oh, yes, absolutely, it's happened, you know, absolutely. I am out of time. We will talk about the challenges to ethics next time. And,
Was any of that
on
chapter 3?
to-
I'm gonna talk about that.
I should be able to get through chapter 3 next time, and then I will, we
Sorry.
can take the third quiz, and I think the fourth exam.
After next.
That's weird.
I
It's like,
Oh, if you got guts, come and see me.
I was like, you're a bitch. I like it. And actually, I low-key kind of